Good morning, everybody. How are we? Woo! I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to be with you all today. So first, I know we did shout outs earlier, but I would be remiss to not start off with thanking Jason, Jennifer, Christine, Holly, Fee, and Kaya for helping bring me here today to speak with all of you. Without you, I wouldn't be able to be here to have the experience to talk with all of you. So I want to give my thanks. I also want to extend my deepest gratitude for every person whose hands touched the making of this happen, right? From our amazing sound and tech people to our catering people, everybody who did something to be here, thank you. And most importantly, thank you all for showing up to engage in these conversations, to hear what I have to say, and to kind of see how we can grow together. And I don't know about you all, just kind of raise of hands. How many of us in this current moment with information and politics feel like, ooh, it's a little scary out there? Okay. Same, okay? hard same, right? Things are absolutely getting a little scary out there. And there are times in our profession where we've dealt with the scary before, right? And so in order for us to kind of begin, for me to kind of tell you how it is that I got to the places that I am, one of the first things I want to do is just kind of give you a little bit of an introduction into who I am, aside from the beautiful introduction I was given. So the reason I want to kind of first start with introducing myself is that I genuinely believe my trajectory in my career is how it was that I was able to come to some of the understandings that I understand today. So first and foremost, I consider myself an educator. I've been an educator for 20-some years, teaching 16-week classes in the humanities, first-year writing courses, things like that. When I started doing that, I also, at that time, was teaching and working in multicultural centers and women's centers over the Illinois Institute of Technology. So I was doing this kind of interesting thing where I was going to school at Loyola full-time, studying gender, race, ethnicity. I was working in these on-campus centers that support gender inclusion, diversity inclusion, things of that nature. But prior to all of that, I thought I was going to be an opera singer. And so I'm like, how did we get from one place to the other place, right? So, I mean, in some ways it makes sense because I'm now an arts librarian, but the opera singing is important to kind of this context, right? Because what it did was it gave me an arts education very early on, right? And so what I have and the way that I look at things is now incredibly informed by this entire trajectory of my career, right? So I spent all of this time thinking I was going to be a performing artist. I studied the arts. I thought I was going to be a singer. And then I moved to teaching pedagogy and teaching how singing and how singing can be this really kind of experience, right? And trying to help unlock that in singers. Then moving to grad school, then to those multicultural centers until I'm finally here in front of you as a librarian. And so this trajectory of becoming a librarian is something that I think really has given me a unique perspective because it is my third career. So unlike a lot of people in our field, my 20 years of experience actively teaching in the classroom, plus that theoretical roots of the fields that I had studied, and my experiences as being a performing artist really gave me this unique perspective on information literacy. And I would argue that the perspectives that I'm getting right now are perspectives that I found from outside of our field. So part of what I hope to do today is to introduce some thoughts and some kinds of premises that our field maybe has not yet had a conversation with, but we might find it useful. So In the 8 years, can't believe it's been 8 years already, since I became a librarian, I've gone on my own research journey to gain even more knowledge. And as was mentioned, one area that I continue to study are Indigenous research methods and knowledge production. And in order to do this, I connected with my own roots. I went to Oaxaca, I started learning from elders. And now that I am also now a more recently appointed arts librarian, it's also taken me to the Performing Arts Archive in New York City, where I'm able to see things and kind of really examine how information is being used there. And it's interesting because I started to really see these interconnectivity between what knowledge methods I was learning in Indigenous studies and also the arts. And so I'm telling you this journey partially because that's part of Indigenous praxis, right? Is that we understand that the story is so much a part of the learning experience just as what it is that we learned. And so I share this with you to kind of give you the framing of who I am and where this talk is coming from, but also to kind of echo what was said earlier. This talk is about to be really interdisciplinary, okay? So we are going to be pulling up from a lot of different places, and hopefully, if I've done my job well, it'll all make sense at the end, okay? All right, who's with me? Woo! Yes, all right. So, critique and optimism. How many of us, just raise of hands, we hear the word critique and we're like, ugh, right? And I think that makes sense, right? The word critique tends to have this negative connotation to it. When we hear the word critique, I think a lot of people automatically they kind of get tense. They're like, oh, I did a really good job. I don't want to know what I didn't do well, right? And for the purposes of this talk, I want us to think about critique in a different kind of way. I'm going to encourage us to think about critique in a different kind of way. So when we think about the word critical, I want us to think about the idea of criticism as a sliver of academic scholarship that really looks at and examines a whole wide variety of things through using a critical lens, right? And when we do that, we begin to see that there are a lot of fields of thought, right? So for some of us who have read critical studies or done this kind of work, maybe some of these names will seem familiar to you, maybe some of them don't. But it's important for us to kind of understand that this idea of critique is one that's found in so many different schools of thought, so many different kinds of fields of study, and that it brings us a wide variety of different ways of looking at things. So because critical theory is found in the academy, it's important to understand the foundations of what critique in this sense is really doing, right? And what the foundation of critique is to analyze and challenge systemic power relationships within society. And the schools of thought here, fundamentally, they all agree that information, knowledge, and wisdom are absolutely shaped by power relationships in society. And it's important for us to understand that while all of these people, these scholars, these schools of thought all kind of agree on that, they also don't agree at all, right? You're gonna find somebody who maybe is in queer theory who is absolutely going to be in disagreement with maybe a Marxist, right? So it's important for us to kind of understand this because this is really something about, this is really something that we see a lot in academic spaces, right? So just because a chemist and an engineer might look at something very, very differently, would we say that the chemist is wrong or the engineer is wrong? No, we would probably say that they're looking at things from different perspectives and different lenses, right? So fundamentally, the core of some of these teachings isn't that critique is about critiquing for critique's sake, right? Like, we've all been in a place where we've gotten what I would consider like unconstructive criticism, right? Where you're just sort of like, you're just being mean at this point, right? Right, we're not talking about that. We're talking about this idea of making something better. And so when we think about the idea that we're moving beyond from critique for the sake of critique, we can kind of get different opportunities to employ technique and critique in how we're looking at things. And one of the ways that I like to utilize it is through my scholarly training, which is in Black, queer, feminist theory. And so for me, a fundamental theme in this is this idea of freedom dreaming. And so Black feminist theory is going to give us a kind of pathway into understanding that there's optimism in that critique. So, scholar Robin D.G. Kelley, who's a prominent Black studies scholar, writes, "Without new visions, we do not know what to build, only what to knock down." I'm gonna let that simmer for us for a second, right? Right, without having a dream, we don't know what to build, we only know what we're knocking down. And how many of us in our profession right now are feeling like we're just like, oh, here's a thing that's going on, and here's another thing that's going on, and you're just kind of like swaying and trying to kind of get rid of things, right? And what he's really trying to get us to kind of think about here is that it's not just about knocking things down. It's about what are we trying to build? What do we actually want, right? And so in his response to thinking about freedom dreams, he often gives us this idea that it's a mechanism to recover ideas from racialized social movements, to use our collective imagination to dream and create new possibilities. That sounds pretty optimistic to me, right? We're dreaming new possibilities out here. So while time doesn't permit us to go into like the deep depths of this as a theory, here are some things that I think are really important for us to understand as key takeaways. One, freedom dreaming is rooted in revolutionary optimism. Despite the idea that we might have some losses along the way, we keep moving forward despite the idea of having a possible defeat. Second, we're building these alternative futures rather than facing those short-term wins. So again, we have a lot of immediate things that are kind of coming at us, but we're not just solely focused on that, we're focused on the future. It also is asking us to think about social movements. Social movements encourage us, they sustain hope. And through ongoing acts of love and connection, we can be integrating freedom dreaming by not simply being reactive, and like in protest, but to be building it sort of from the outset. And the other part that I think is maybe perhaps one of the most encouraging things is that there's possibility for fundamental transformation in the wake of catastrophe. Okay, now, I don't know that I'm gonna say we're in catastrophe mode. I'll let you decide. But what I will say is, we got some challenges. We got challenges, right? And so here are a couple of challenges that I can kind of see firsthand. So for me as an educator, as an information worker, I feel like I'm living in a moment where there are like a million dragons, they're coming at me, and I don't have any swords, like just multiple heads, right? Here are some things that I'm noticing. So, and these are things that I've noticed have fundamentally changed since I entered the profession in 2018. So in the beginning, I was starting to see that libraries across the nation have seen a decline in funding. Even ostensibly well-funded libraries, such as like the New York Public Library, have had newsworthy challenges asking for campaigns for donations. We have seen a giant decline in K through 12 education where librarians are not in the schools, right? This means that for our students, they're not engaging in information literacy in library spaces. What that does mean is that our educators, our other colleagues and teachers in K through 12 are now saddled with having to teach information literacy on top of the other stuff that they're teaching, right? In addition to this, I don't know about you all, my students are struggling with short attention spans. And I see people being like, yes, right? Short attention spans. I also see them struggling a lot with critical reasoning skills. And lastly, the other challenge that I see is around censorship. And so that's where we're gonna predominantly keep our time of the talk today, is the discussion of censorship and how understanding censorship is something that we absolutely kind of can use in this moment to do that kind of dreaming of the kind of new information literacy that we want. And in these challenges, we're seeing a lot of new things. So that was some of the things I was saying I heard, I was experiencing when I started my career. But now I'm also starting to see some other things on the research side of things. For example, the current government administration is having an incredible impact on researchers. I see this a lot on the medical side. I don't know if my fellow colleagues here have noticed that there are restrictions in words that we can use around metadata and like Library of Congress subject headings, right? And we see a lot of this censorship happen under what people call that DEI umbrella. So while we have so many challenges of the moment today, we're gonna talk explicitly about censorship, and we're gonna have some optimism thrown in there, okay? All right, so censorship. Actually, before I do that, let me define it for how I'm thinking about it for the purpose of our talk. So the first thing to note is that I am defining the idea of censorship as being in an umbrella term that can incorporate a lot of different kinds of things. So fundamentally, the way that I am looking at censorship for the purposes of our conversation is defining it by the ability and attempt to disrupt the flow of information, okay? And there are a lot of different ways that this can look. So, for example, this can look like research that never gets to happen because a professor told a student they couldn't study a particular field, right? Race, gender, disability, so on and so forth. This looks like researchers not getting appropriate funding because they're looking at mortality rates of Black women and not white women. This can look like banning specific curricula, such as Black studies, Chicano studies, disability studies, in places of higher education. And it also is inclusive of ways that most of us traditionally think of censorship, which is book bans. Oop. My pages are out of order, 1 sec. Okay, so while things like a professor not allowing a student to study something or not having access to information to do that study, thinking about how it is that things get funded or not funded, right? All of these things operate a little differently from each other, but fundamentally they're coming from the same spot, which is being engaged in some kind of mechanism that is going to prevent information from flowing and being created. And what we currently have the most data on, thanks to our friends at ALA, are book bans. So let's take a look at some book ban information and book ban data. So Currently, the ALA recently prepared for Book Ban Week this year, and they released a lot of rich information. Shout out to our ALA friends for doing this work because it is really beautiful. We don't have time to show all the infographics, but I do highly recommend for folks to go to the ALA webpage and take a look at some of this because there's a lot more than we're able to go into. So here's a few things that I think are pertinent to this conversation. So first of all, as we can see here, there is a vast amount more of challenged books in the last few years since they have started collecting this data. And I don't know if you can kind of see, right? Like, we're floating along, and then 2021, we see this spike, and then we just see these major spikes. The second notable thing is that the ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom is reporting that 39% of the titles that are considered for banning are titles that are about minoritized populations in some capacity. So queer, LGBTQ, BIPOC people, people with disabilities, so on and so forth. The other thing that is pretty interesting is that the books that are being challenged are not necessarily coming from the concerned mom that is in their community, right? These are being connected to larger political groups and movements, right? And we can kind of see this from this quote from Sarah Lambden, who's currently the executive director of the Office for Intellectual Freedom, where she's talking about the idea that these campaigns are not spontaneous, right? They're crafted, they're organized. And here's some other things just to kind of understand about how censorship works, which is that somebody challenging a book does not necessarily mean the book is banned. What it means is that it's an attempt to remove or restrict those materials. The idea with challenging, though, is that it's not simply just somebody kind of going up to a librarian and saying, I don't want this book here, right? It is a much more formal process than that. And so the amount of books that were banned from libraries in 2025 exceeds 5,000. And I want to be clear that these are not challenged books. These are books that are just flat out banned, right? So the other thing that I think is really kind of important for us to notice in this kind of storytelling is that in 2024, one of the things you're going to notice is that there was a dip in challenged titles. And one of the things that, this is a ponderance, that I can't help but wonder if this is partially connected to what was sort of coming out of the ALA at the time, where the ALA was noticing that we were engaging in the field a process that they called soft censorship. So soft censorship is this idea that we're not necessarily going to take a book out of the library. We're not going to necessarily censor it. But what we are going to do is make that book not very accessible or visible, right? So if we have a book that we know we want to have, but we can't have, maybe it's not on the shelf, maybe it has to be requested. So that means the patron is going through a lot of extra steps in order to access the book. So do you see how that's sort of like a soft censorship, right? The people can still access it, but how you access it, there's a lot of barriers. And when we're thinking about all of these barriers as to why people would engage in soft censorship, it makes sense. Okay, y'all. The next slide is like jump scare warning, okay? All right? Oh, wait, no, well, actually, this is a jump scare warning, but this wasn't the one I was talking about. This is just a kind of, again, an understanding of kind of where we are, right? This is the amount of books that were challenged about LGBTQ and people of color. This is the percentage that of the pressure from outside groups, right? So this is a jump scare in and of itself. This is like a warm-up jump scare for the real jump scare. You ready? So why does soft censorship and things like that happen? Because of this, right? The reason people engage in soft censorship is because they don't want to be harmed, right? When we start understanding how some of this kind of works, we kind of start to see it, right? We start to see, well, soft censorship happens because people are afraid of losing their jobs. It's a kind of punishment, right? It's a kind of way of saying, hey, if you're doing this thing, we have a way of punishing you, and the way of punishing you is that you don't have a livelihood. Does that scare people? I mean, that scares me. Okay? That's scary, right? So it's important for us to understand in this information literacy moment where for some people, their access to information about subjects that are more prone to being banned may not have access to information they seek because information workers are scared to lose their job or worse. And we might be looking at this and asking ourselves, how we get here, right? How did we get here? And in my research, I can't point to a singular moment, but I do think understanding the more recent history of how censorship is happening can help us understand how to combat it. So the next thing I want us to do is to just take a moment and think about the symbiotic relationship between education and libraries, and how what happens in education settings has a direct impact on what happens to us in libraries, right? So here's a little recent history on how I think we're getting here. Informally dubbed the Stop the Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees, or the Stop Woke Act, Florida's 2022 Individual Freedom Act requires instruction and instructional materials along with a set of what they call, in quotes, individual freedom guidelines. Most provocatively, this is one of the guidelines, in quotes. A person should not be instructed that he or she must feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress for actions in which he or she played no part committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. So this is essentially saying that only certain kinds of information are able to flow in that system. So this has had a devastating consequence for K-12 educators. K-12 librarians and educators can face felony charges if they are found to distribute materials to minors that violate the law. News headlines covering the tension have suggested that grade school educators and staff are being told by administrators, as some of these signs say, to hide all their books because they're simply unaware of which books were in violation of the new policies. Scholars in education who focus on areas of attack are finding their livelihoods challenged in these ways. But it's not just impacting our K-12 school librarians and educators. We're also seeing this in higher education. But in higher education, it's working a little differently. So continuing with the Stop Woke Act, this law notably led to the manipulation of the College Board's process for advanced placement, like considering AP courses, and in particular, their African American Studies course. While largely developed and controlled within the United States, the College Board's AP program reaches more than 100 countries, including Canada, where more than 700 secondary schools are enrolled. Florida Commissioner of Education at the time, Manny Diaz, aired grievances with several topics listed in the proposed course. And he specifically is drawing ire towards several Black scholars, including names like Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, and who I just also mentioned, Robin D.G. Kelly. As a result of the state law, the College Board agreed to dilute its process curriculum, which is poised to affect the implementation of the course on an international level. So on April 24th in 2023, the College Board announced that it would change the curriculum for advanced placement African American studies courses to be in step with the recommendations of the Stop Woke Act. And so they openly acknowledged that they would be watering down the content to be in lockstep with more conservative states. Most of the coverage of this topic has been sort of filed under headlines that say things like African American and Black studies are being erased from curricula. And that is absolutely true, right? We can see how this is happening. But I would ask us to take it a step further, which is that while articulating Black erasure isn't incorrect, it's important to understand that Black history is not the only thing that should be concerning to us as academic teaching librarians, but also the ways in which the information is being criminalized. To say that this is, so this is to say that we're finding ourselves in these situations where criminalizing various types of information and information flow is becoming really apparent. And how does this all work? What are the key mechanisms that are needed for censorship, book bans, information restriction to happen? Carceral logics, okay? So for those of us who maybe haven't heard the term carceral logics before, this is a way of us to sort of understand that we have punitive systems that kind of embed themselves in how society functions that don't necessarily need a police officer, a judge, or formal punishment or punitive kinds of official people for it to be enacted. So carceral logics, here are a couple of key takeaways. So the first is that it's a way of viewing the world and the people through a lens of punishment and imprisonment, right? So it's naturally going to be something that is punitive in nature. As I mentioned before, it is something that is going to be pervasive beyond the formal carceral system itself. And the idea of it, the way that the punishment sort of works, is that it seeks to sort of disenfranchise people in a way that sort of others them, that doesn't sort of allow for community growth and kind of community building, right? And so when we think about, if we go back to these scary slides, right, these jump scare slides, are we beginning to see how carceral logic is informing these, right? So for book bans, for censorship, for any kind of information restriction to happen, it requires a kind of carceral logic in order to do that. So for our theory nerds in the group, which is maybe not all of us, but you can often find the kind of concept of this in a pretty prominent theorist, Michel Foucault's work. And he talks about this idea of self-policing as a panopticon. And it basically kind of talks about the ways in which we police ourselves or the ways in which policing happens and we don't know. He often identifies places like hospitals and educational settings that can be primed with the location of this phenomenon. And so I'm going to argue that it's in understanding how this carcerality happens that we can understand what is actually at play when we're talking about book bans or when we're talking about censorship, right? The moment we understand that there's this punitive aspect, and that's what fundamentally is kind of controlling the flow of information, the more we kind of know how to work with it and address it. And so this brings us to this idea of neutrality. Show of hands, we've all kind of heard this idea, right? The idea that libraries are objectively neutral. And we know that a lot of scholars have kind of pointed these things out. So let's kind of put these two things together for a moment. So given that we know how carceral logics can be applied to how information flows and restricts, then we begin to understand that legality and carcerality can be utilized to censor and restrict informations. And so what then happens when we look at our own biases within the field, within our discipline, to sort of understand where carceral logics maybe have been applied before? And what becomes telling, I think, in this examination is that the same demographics that we have seen on, oops, I went too far. This slide, right, of who is predominantly having their restriction of their information, right, is historically the same groups of people who have had their information restricted, right? So we're talking predominantly minoritized people. So many scholars have pointed out the biases in our libraries. From Sandy Berman, who is pictured here, who wrote about using pejorative terms for subject headings and advocated for minoritized people to have subject headings that identified themselves from non-dominant perspectives, to scholars such as Nicole Cook, Allison Lewis, who discuss that there's no such thing as neutrality in libraries. And to add to their voices, I would argue, does this look neutral? Is this neutrality, right? I mean, arguably, the idea that politics and things like that are not in our systems, I think, can be questioned a little when we're talking about punitive political outcomes for doing our jobs, right? And so when we're thinking about neutrality, I think a lot about a lot of the ways in which our libraries and spaces aren't neutral. One of the stories that always sits with me, which is former ALA president Tracy Hall had this wonderful piece about her experience with libraries, in which she talked about how, you know, the library in her Black neighborhood was so different than the library experience of her, you know, the wider part of town, right? So we know that politics are absolutely sort of baked in. We know that neutrality is sort of a myth. I would argue at minimum, critical information literacy people would say it's a myth, right? And so the concept of objectivity plays a central role in scholarly and practical conversations amongst librarians in ways in which the government is engaged in our profession. And I don't know that we often think about this, but it's really important for us to kind of understand the ways in which we have governmental relationships to information. One of the most prominent examples is the US Library of Congress. So do we have catalogers maybe up in the house? Do we? Yeah, we love it. Y'all doing the hard work out here, right? So the US Library of Congress subject heading is, you know, it's a system of organizing information that is actually the basis and foundation for how the US government itself organizes information. So the ways we store, collect, house, and describe the ways we store, collect, and house and describe information are heavily influenced by the US government. And by extension, through the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress is a subject heading system that is used globally in academic libraries, right? So it's not just in the United States. Canada has its own kind of like, you know, version of it where they kind of tack onto it. But these are also, it's important, I think in my research I noticed like the Oxford University is recently transitioning its subject heading system over to the Library of Congress. So it's to say that our subject headings have a very, very wide reach. And why is that sort of concerning? And maybe why is that concerning in 2026? So the Library of Congress articulates that its mission is to serve Congress with the highest quality of research, analysis, information, and confidential consultation to support the exercise of its legislative, representational, and oversight duties in its role as a co-equal branch of government. Okay? So, despite its ubiquity, the thing that most of us might be surprised to know is that the Library of Congress subject headings were never, ever intended to be utilized in any other place other than the Library of Congress. So we have a whole subject heading system that is developed and based on what our government needs. And because of that, one of the interesting things of scholars who do look at subject headings is they will point to the fact that the neutral basis of our subject headings lean Protestant, white cis man, straight, able-bodied, and that is really what a lot of the language and discourse it is that we utilize when we're using subject headings. So what's an example of this, and why does this matter? So the most recent, or kind of example, is an ongoing battle to change the subject headings from undocumented people for undocumented peoples. So established in the 1980s by the Library of Congress, aliens, illegal, was the subject heading created to describe undocumented people. In 1993, the subject heading was revised to illegal aliens, and in the year 2010, a campaign called Drop the I Word asked media outlets to no longer use the term illegal because of the word was racialized, but it also was legally inaccurate. And people also just sort of fundamentally found the word to be dehumanizing. This campaign, by the way, was very successful in so many different outlets, like the AP transitioned to using this language. A lot of places did. But guess who didn't, guess who was reluctant to change the language? The Library of Congress, right? And the current subject heading is undocumented immigrants, and we want to give a shout out to students at Dartmouth who did a heck of a ton of organizing to get that going. So wherever they are, yes, thank you. And so examining what happened in that 2014 request actually reveals so much about how the Library of Congress is actually poised within the governmental systems. So petitions to change words in the Library of Congress are not a new thing. We need it a lot, particularly because like words get old. Like I think one time I was doing research and it was like water closet, and I was like, makes sense. We might want to change that to like restroom, right? Like we're not really calling it water closet anymore. But then things can also be utilized to kind of get us up to date with language and kind of hearkening back to our friend here, Sandy, of understanding that words have meaning, and we should maybe try to use words that describe the community based on the words that that community would want to use for themselves. And so, despite the fact that changing subject headings doesn't get a lot of press, Senator Ted Cruz decided this one. This is the one I'm gonna be like, I don't know about, right? And I know this is really small, but this is a letter up here that Ted Cruz sent to the Librarian of Congress at the time, Carla Hayden. And so essentially what he does is that he, in the letter, he asks that, he's articulating his concern around changing the subject heading and the implications it has from Congress. And what he says is that removing illegal aliens politicizes the term. He writes, we strongly urge the Library of Congress not to make politically motivated changes to the neutral indexing, language, and search functions that are so vital to accessing the information held in the library and the library's reputation as a non-political organization. In this letter, Cruz perpetuates this myth that libraries are inherently neutral spaces, even though the Library of Congress is a governmental agency and by extension, a political institution. His investment, along with others, in maintaining the language in this way is also a way to control the discourse in Congress. In his letter, he speaks about the relationship between the language found and in the Library of Congress subject headings. And what he's doing is he's drawing the connection to federal law, noting that a different term would be out of lockstep with the language used at the federal level. His astute connection between these two begins to shed light on why there is such a deep desire to maintain language used in state-based discourse. Because if we change the language of government in one capacity, i.e. the Library of Congress, then what that does is it opens the door for us to change the language and the discourse in the rest of the government. So, there have been subsequent changes, attempts at changing the words, and I think we ultimately landed in with non-citizens in 2021. But part of why I bring up this sort of contention and the sort of political underpinning of how our information gets distributed and its connections to the government is because it's my fundamental belief that the understanding of this only makes for better information literacy. Understanding the underpinnings of where our information comes from and how it's being organized and given to us gives us a clearer eye on what it is that we're looking at. And so, you're all like, did we say optimism? I know. One more history portion, and then we're gonna get to so much optimism, okay? So, part of understanding bias and understanding censorship and understanding how the government works in our information systems, right? Kind of, remember the way that for many of us who work in higher ed, the ways our books and stuff are coded are using Library of Congress subject headings, right? And so the neutrality is, as I would argue, is that our neutrality that we find in our naming systems is probably reflective of the neutrality found in our government, right? Because they're symbiotic. And so the hardship about where we are right now is that it's hard to sort of know how to kind of get out of things, right? And so what I would like to do now that we kind of understand how this information is being kind of controlled is to understand some things about the past in addition to what we just sort of understood about information in a way to understand how we can keep teaching. So in acknowledging the histories of how racialized education is still impacting learners today, many library educators, myself included, it wasn't until I started reading books by Black educators in particular that I started to learn so much more about the history of racialized education in our country. So, for example, many of us might be surprised to know that historic US desegregation laws and legal decisions, thinking like Brown versus the Board of Education, were not the boon to educational justice and were not lauded as these big, expansive ways of doing education for Black students, right? So in his study, there is a scholar named Adam Faircloud, and he'd conducted a series of interviews with the Black community Students, teachers, and many of whom in this study articulated that so much was lost in desegregating schools. Schools, much like churches, were the cornerstone of Black communities, often embracing a holistic approach to students' well-being through community-centered involvement. During and after desegregation, many Black educators no longer had work. If they did get work, they were offered custodial positions in non-segregated schools. And many Black students were taught by white teachers who up to that point had never taught a Black student. And it removed Black children from their communities. In turn, many of the interviewees articulated that the desegregation efforts had a negative impact on the community as a whole. And the history of racialized education in the United States isn't limited to the Black experience. American boarding schools were established with the objective of creating good citizens through kidnapping Native children and forcing their assimilation into Eurocentric American culture, resulting in the attempted erasure of Native cultures, languages, and just generally an attempt to murder the sort of knowledge and wisdom and cultural practices of indigenous peoples. Only since the passing of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978 could parents of indigenous children invoke the legal right to refuse their children to be put into a boarding school. That's not that long ago, y'all. And even too, when we talk about desegregating schools, sometimes when I talk to my students, I'm like, Ruby Bridges has a TikTok account, y'all. We're really not that far away from this, right? So similar to residential schools, right? We also see erasure of native languages. We see education across this country where English-only education is practiced. As of this moment, states like Arizona have enacted laws that require schools in the state that they must use English, despite the fact that there's no official language within the United States, and there are a ton of heritage speakers within the state. And so, you ready for the optimism? Because it's coming, I swear it's coming. So, in many ways, this law and this moment are nothing new. Information workers have seen the criminalization of information happening throughout world history, from 20th century European fascism, anti-socialist McCarthyism, the Tea Party movement of the late 2000s. They all involved some kind of criminalization of anti-hegemonic content. And also, that gets extended to the people who teach it, who help with the research consults to do it, all of that, right? So librarians and library workers were aware of so many of these things in historical records. And it's important for us to also note that in my research, going through and taking a look at historical documents in the ALA, we've discussed this before. We've been here before, right? And so going back to this kind of idea of optimism, the optimism for me is that we're not anywhere that we haven't been before. And you know what? Are we all still here? We're here, right? And so what are the things that we can kind of learn to kind of keep it going? So for me, this idea of freedom dreamings is how can we build on the histories and the knowledge of how censorship works in order for us to understand this moment and how we teach to this moment. And for me, the big optimism lies in how we look at the wisdom that was left for us. we got to go back to the people who did it the first time, right? So this is where I would really say, for me, as a Chicana, as a critical scholar, I personally find that our ancestral legacies are the originators of information literacy. So for folks who maybe aren't aware of Ida B. Wells, right? Ida B. Wells reported on lynching and racist activities at a time when that was not safe, right? Going back to safety, it was not a safe thing to do, right? But she developed information because she knew it needed to happen. And we could see this a lot in other kinds of Black information workers, right? The need for the creation of the Chicago Defender, right? That's helping people through the Great Migration, all the way down to things like Ebony Magazine, right? Because ancestral legacies aren't just about the sad and horrible things that happen to us. It's also about celebrating culture and joy and all of those other things. So the creators who are working on that and sustaining that are part of our legacy. When I was doing research in Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico, I came across the Cordova sisters. Patsy and Nadine Cordova are beloved educators in their community. And in 1997, they were suspended for having taught Chicano history at a high school in Vaughan, New Mexico. And the sisters later shared why they thought this history was central to their curriculum. Quote, "There was a lot of shame in my generation, a lot of shame in being who you are," said Patsy. "You didn't want to associate with being Mexican." Nadine added, "It makes me so mad when I look back. Why didn't anybody teach me about Chicano history? I don't want my students to walk away and say, no one ever tried to teach me. At least they know I tried to teach them something relevant." And so prior to their firing, the ACLU involved themselves in that case, and the specificities of why they were let go and suspended was the articulation given by the superintendent at the school at the time. Quote, "You do not have the authority to continue to teach matters that are judged by the board and myself to be ethnically divisive and demeaning and using derogatory stereotypes that are racist in describing majority populations. This must stop immediately." Why does that sound familiar? Didn't we just, right? We just heard about what was going on in Florida, right? Where it's like, oh, we can't have people feeling specific ways, right? So to me, there's a lot of optimism in understanding that other people have contended with this and kind of understand how it works and how it functions. But fundamentally, I would say between Ida B. Wells and the Cordova sisters and all the other people who were kind of saying there's a need for something, fundamentally, the way they were able to identify that need was by being critical, right? It took a critical eye for the Cordova sisters to look at the curriculum and say, this doesn't really represent my students. This doesn't really represent this, and we should give some local history, right? And that critique, in that way, turned into a kind of optimism, right? Because we were able to figure out, well, there's a need here. How do we move forward with that need? And the last thing that I have here are elders. So this is actually a picture of my maestro that teaches me. He lives in Oaxaca. And when we think about indigenous culture and we think about things found in non-Western forms of information, what we also begin to understand is the supreme optimism of the fact that this information is still alive. Like, we really just went through all of the ways government, society, all of these things try to banish information, kill information, murder information, right? But we still have living legacies of people who have that information, who hold it, right? And so there's so much power here. There's so much power in understanding how other people have met the moment. And the cool thing is they left us some strategies on how to do that. So we're going to get into the pedagogy talk of how to take everything that we kind of just talked about, which was a lot. So if we needed like a break, like, okay, right? So now we're going to kind of talk about pedagogy and how it is to kind of use this to kind of teach in this moment. And so for me, when I started to begin to think about this and started to see and do research on this, a couple of things immediately came to my head, which is we're about to see a lot more restriction in information. We're about to see a lot more information that is misinformation, disinformation, right? And our students are having to learn in an environment that's a little hard for all of that. It's hard for us, right? And so I began to think to myself, how do we teach information literacy in the landscape I just talked about, right? And the first thing for me is to get us to think about our relationship to information differently. So, for the sake of the rest of this talk, I want us to kind of think about all the biases, or all the baggage, rather, we carry with us about information, like, as best as we can, clean slate, okay? Like, all the things we think we know about information and our profession, let's kind of take it and stick it on a corner, and we can always go back to it. But for the time being, let's think about what it means for information to sort of look like how I'm suggesting. So for critical information scholars, there's a core tenet, and the core tenet is that information critique must be without transcendentals. And essentially, what that is kind of saying is that the idea that things are hard and fast and absolute is maybe not the way that we want to think about information and our relationship to information. So in his work, Lash asks us to accept that there may never be one ultimate answer. And I think that universities as a whole are a great example of where we can see this in action. So a field like archaeology and computer science can seem so different, right? And the way that they might look at something is very, very different. But we don't, in a university setting, we don't say, well, I'm sorry, archaeology just isn't cool because it doesn't agree with engineering, right? And even in like the same schools of thought, right? Like how many of you, I mean, even if you yourself are a part of an academic department, do y'all agree on the same stuff? No, right? We all don't agree. There's no consensus, right? Because here's the thing, from one person's perspective, this thing makes sense. From another person's perspective, this thing makes sense, right? And so when you think about it in a university setting, we all, theoretically, coexist happily, right? So like a Marxist, and part of it is like if we think about it, like we know a Marxist thinks this, and that's their school of thought, right? We know somebody who focuses on gender studies, like that's their school of thought, right? And in a university, we always look at it like they can all coexist. But we don't always do that necessarily in information literacy. Right? We often sometimes really can end up bogging ourselves down with the idea of this thing is absolute 100% fact. And also, let's be real, our students want that from us. Like, how many times have you had a student be like, yeah, but is this gonna be the thing? And you're like, yeah, And it's like, no, but real, like for real, we're real. Like, is this what I need, right? And part of that is because there's this sort of training of this idea between good information and bad information, right? So good versus bad. The first thing that I would say that I learned from people like I.D.B. Wells and from I.D.B. Wells is that there is no such thing as good or bad information. For somebody who is formerly enslaved, who is looking to find ways to stay safe, is the really, really terrible stuff that someone wrote about Black people, maybe she has an inherent judgment on it. It's not great, right? What we're seeing, what we're reading. But it's good for her, right? It's a good piece of information for her because she now understands how to react to it, how to work with it, right? So one of the first things that I would really encourage us to do is to break out of this binary of thinking of what is good information, what is bad information. Because oftentimes when we do this, we have a very specific clocked-in idea. I think oftentimes, and I do this with my students sometimes, where I'll be like, okay, how many of us have been told .gov is like a safe, good website to pull information from? And then they're like, yeah. And then I'll ask them, has a government ever lied to its people? And then they're like, yeah, right? And there's this cognitive dissonance, right? So part of what it is, instead of thinking about information as good or bad, what if we look at it from this perspective of lens? And I offer this because I offer the term lens as an alternative to the term bias. And the reason I do this is because bias, first of all, it's super fraught, right? We hear the term bias and we automatically have negative connotations, right? But the truth of the matter is that there's no piece of information that doesn't have bias, because fundamentally, the purpose of information is to convey something, right? So there's no way a thesis statement is a bias, because it's setting up exactly what it's trying to tell you to do, right? So instead of working with students and being like, well, this has a bias towards this, and this has a bias towards that, what does it look like instead to say, what is the lens? What is the perspective, right? It goes back to that kind of idea of an archaeologist is going to look at something differently than an art historian, but they all might be looking at the same object, right? So instead of being like, this is good information, this is bad information, if we employ the term lens, what that does is it allows students to make a determination about if the information is good for their use, not their own personal position on the piece of information. And this is where remember I told you art comes in, okay? Music appreciation. How many of us have ever taken a music appreciation class, right? One of the first things a professor will tell you is, I don't care if you like it, right? Like in some ways I do care because I want to know what you like, but the argument, right, the crux of what it is that you're doing isn't reliant upon if you like it or not. Because many of us can look at something like, there are so many genres of music where I'm like, not my bag. But I can know that it's well done. I can tell that the musicians are doing a great job, right? And so this is where it becomes really, really important, this idea of lens. And I use Bad Bunny up here because, first of all, I love Bad Bunny. But secondly, because I think this halftime show in some ways gave us a tangible perspective on this idea of lens. We had a cultural moment in the United States where somebody came out and they made a giant form of entertainment that was through the lens and perspective of somebody who is born and raised in Puerto Rico and has a lot to say about it, right? In terms of rhythm, sound, all of that. And the lens is going to tell you different things depending on what you know. For example, this image of them on the power lines, for some people, they might just be like, that's lit. Like they're up there, right? They're doing like acrobatic stuff, right? But for people who are familiar with the island and the history of the island, right, we know that that's a call out to the power grid issues and the power issues that the island faces, right? So the lens is going to give that perspective, right? So again, what if we get rid of this idea of bias and use lens? And then, using the Super Bowl as an example, art as information. What does it mean when we incorporate more art as information? Because I guarantee you, the sounds that we heard, the rhythms that we saw, the dancing, the costuming, every single part of that performance told us something, right? And it's in art that so many things that are important get hidden. When we think about ancestral legacies, and we think about where a lot of stuff happens. And as a sidebar, this is a personal note, I don't think it's particularly, I think it's fitting that we also lose arts funding the same way, right? I think these things are correlative. And then lastly, indigenous and pre-colonial information. This is where art and that pre-colonial thing intersect. Because for so many people in the Western world, we think of information as books, as tactile, which is great. We love that, right? But information is in dance, it's in art, and for so many indigenous people, it's about the action and the ritual. And this is something that I really learned when I started to do research in the performing arts and this. Because I thought to myself, where does this look familiar? And it looks familiar because the legacy of being told how to do something is something that can't be written on paper, right? I mean, think about if you have family histories of cooking or things like that in your family, and your mom, your abuela, somebody teaches you how to make something. Have you ever had like somebody be like, oh, it's just a taste? And you're like, what is taste? You know? But these are the things that happen through this learning process, right? And so I have, in the Q&A, I want to say, I have tangible examples of what all of these things look like in an information and literacy classroom, so please feel free to ask me about those things. But I want to leave on this note of community. We're all here because we want to figure out how to teach information literacy. And I strongly believe that it's through conversations together that we're going to figure it out. And I also mean for those conversations to be inclusive of K through 12 educators. They often get lost, our public librarians, our community college librarians, because the truth is that we're entering a system now where students aren't going to have access to information. So what does that happen? What does that do when we get them in our classrooms? And depending on what state they come from, that state didn't allow this book. So they don't know that that's an answer. Or what happens when students feel penalized for saying something like, Christopher Columbus didn't find America, right? How do we work with those things? These are some offerings. With that, I'm going to give Q&A. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say, back to really very quickly, this idea of art as information, low-key, high-key, I've been doing this the whole presentation. So I don't know if you paid attention to any of the slides, but the images there were also telling us a lot of information. So thank you so much for your time. I am excited to take questions and to continue the conversation. Thank you.